Okay, I'm going to draw your attention here. I think most of you are able to get through most of the questions there. So, for if you're new here, so the goal with this next time is not so much for me to now rehash everything you went over in the teaching time, but now to kind of come to it from just some things that I observed as I was looking over the text and some things that came to mind, and then hopefully some things that'll spark your conversations in the next part of the evening. So, feel free to grab refills of drinks or use the washroom, whatever you need to do as well as we get going. So here's the big idea that we're going to walk through, at least in this teaching time. It's that the Lord doesn't require neat and tidy to accomplish his purposes for those that he loves. And just so you know, what I'll probably do each week is send a little bit of a hey, thanks for coming. Here's some links if you need information. And also here's the notes that were part of the teaching, because I know some of you get stressed if you don't copy everything down from the notes. And I don't want that kind of stress in your life in these sessions. So take notes for things that interest you, not to just mimic what's on the screen, but do whatever you want. I think that's one of the main things we can learn from Solomon's life in general. And I think as we're introduced to Solomon, I just see mess all over the place, and yet the Lord accomplishing his purposes. So we're going to look at that kind of twofold thing. We're going to look at the mess that's going on in behind the scenes and as kind of like the prequel to where we jumped in. You know, when you do one of these life stories studies, you always have to pick a spot to start in. And I'm super thankful for the work that Teresa Teeter put in to help guide our weeks and provide some of the bones and structure of our curriculum. And she did a great job setting out the different passages. And you have to start somewhere, right? And so, but there is a backstory. And so we're going to look a little bit at that. And so both the mess and this idea of the love child are part of our introduction to Solomon. So first, let's look at the mess. So as I was reading this and doing my homework and my research on it, the thing that came to my mind in these first few verses was that if you have a bit of an awareness of what's going on behind the scenes of the scriptures, you notice a few things that are already a little bit messy. So King David said, "Call in Bathsheba." So she came into the king's presence and stood before him. And the king then took an oath, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon, your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." So it's messy because we are introduced to a character in this section, Bathsheba, her son, and the fact that he's going to be king. So when it comes to the mess for Solomon, the mess is both in his home and also to do with his throne, okay? So I think a lot of you probably got there in your homework, but I'm going to read parts of that 2 Samuel portion that I talked about before. But when it comes to the mess, we do have to think a little bit about this dynamic of King David and Bathsheba and the backstory of how that happened, because King Solomon comes from that relationship. So 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 11, starting verse 1, a bit of the backstory of David and Bathsheba now. So in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness, which was a ritual purity act for the Israelites. And then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Right? Let's talk shop a bit. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. A little bit of background for that. When the Israelites were in war, one of the rules was that you weren't to engage in relations with your wife while you were active in fighting. And so that's one of the reasons why he wouldn't go. It wasn't like him and Bathsheba had some kind of tension, and he was like, "I don't want to go in there. The way I left wasn't cool." This is like you would expect that a noble Israelite warrior would play by the rules and not go into his house while he was still active duty, right? For all he knows, he was just called for an update on the war, but he's still considered an active soldier. David was told Uriah did not go home. David's like, okay. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark in Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Right? He's saying, I know the rules. Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I'll send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants, and he did not go home. As one commentator has put it, Uriah drunk is more noble than David sober. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so that he'll be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. And when the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. And then later in verse 26, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. So this is how David brings Bathsheba into his collection of wives. And now Solomon gets introduced to the story. So she has a son through David's assault, and the son dies. And then we hear the story continue. David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead, the child that him and Bathsheba conceived. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "Yes," they replied, "he is dead." And then David got up from the ground, and after he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went down to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. His attendants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat?" And he answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he's dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah. So Solomon's story begins in some messiness. There's so much. We could do 6 weeks on the story of David and Uriah the Hittite and Bathsheba, and I will send out some links with some like, hey, if you're interested in that story, here's a conversation to watch. Here's some things to think through. I'm happy to chat with any of you about what's going on in this scene if you want to talk through it more. We don't have time tonight to get into the details, but what I want us to see is the fact that Solomon's start is in the midst of a really messy situation. And it's not just his family, but also his kingship in particular, when we look at his throne, also has a messy start. You probably picked this up in your reading tonight, when we looked at Adonijah, and I heard most of the tables trying to figure out how do we pronounce these names. And the solution is don't worry about it. You know, there's probably 3 ways you could pronounce all of them. As long as we're all reading the same text, we're tracking with any pronunciation we're saying, okay? Here's the latter half of that verse you already looked at, but let me just read it again. So Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaniah son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites and the Perethites went down and had Solomon mount King David's mule, and they escorted him to Gihon. Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon, right? So this is all just the ceremony to anoint Solomon as king. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" And all the people went up after him, playing pipes, rejoicing greatly, so that the ground shook with the sound. Adonijah, one of David's other sons, and all the guests who were with him heard it as they were finishing their feast. And on hearing the sound of the trumpet, Joab asked, "What's the meaning of all the noise in the city?" Even as he was speaking, Jonathan, son of Abiathar, the priest, arrived. Adonijah said, "Come in. A worthy man like you must be bringing good news." "Not at all," Jonathan answered. "Our Lord King David has made Solomon king. The king has sent with him Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaniah the son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites, the Perethites, the whole crew, right? The whole king-making crew have been sent, and they've put him on the king's mule. And Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet have anointed him king at Gihon. From there they've gone up cheering, and the city resounds with it. That's the noise you hear. Moreover, Solomon has taken his seat on the royal throne." So the backstory, as I'm sure most of you as the tables got to, was that Adonijah took the throne from David and basically gathered a group of people around him who were like, "Yeah, you're the new king. This makes sense. You're one of the older brothers. This is how kings work, especially in the world around us, that the oldest and the strongest sons get named king." And so he started acting like he was king. The problem was that wasn't actually how the story was going to go. And so Solomon was named king instead. And so his kingship starts with this tension with a brother of now him being king instead of this other guy. And you have some people who are like, "Wait, I thought that guy was the king, but now you're actually the king." So like in terms of starting your kingship, not a great start because it's a little contested. But it's not just his kingship in particular. I actually think if we're reading this text and we're tracking with how the Bible has been speaking about these things as we've gone along, we should think to ourselves, actually the kingship in general is kind of a messy situation. Here's why I say that. Not just Solomon's kingship, but the function of the king in Israel is a bit of a messy situation. So 1 Samuel chapter 8. So Samuel is a prophet of the Lord, and he was a prophet of the people of Israel before they had any kings, okay? So all the elders of Israel gathered together, and they came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "You're old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now, appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people who are saying to you. Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they've rejected, but they've rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them. But warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." See, sometimes we talk about these roles in the people of Israel, right? The king and the prophet and the priest as these super important roles in the people of Israel. And that's true, right? The king was the leader. The priest was the mediator between sinful people and a holy God. And the prophet was the one who was supposed to speak to the people when they were doing what was right in their own eyes and sinning against God. The problem is that the plan for God's relationship with humanity was to not need a king or a priest or a prophet. All of these are just things that have come along the way. So to view these roles in these high esteem as though these things that need to go on and on is actually to kind of misunderstand. It's part of the tragedy of the Bible that these roles are needed. But the kingship in particular is actually something that is explicitly told to the people of Israel, don't want this. Don't need this. You don't need a king. 1 Samuel 12, so later in the story of Samuel the prophet dealing with the people of Israel, he says to them about Saul, the first king, now here's the king you've chosen, the one you've asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your ancestors. Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain. And you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. It's kind of tense, right? Then Samuel called on the Lord. And that same day, the Lord sent thunder and rain. And all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. The people all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we will not die, for we have added to all of our sins the evil of asking for a king. Do not be afraid, Samuel replied. You have done all this evil. Yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Yet, if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish. This is fascinating, at least to me. Because here's how the story goes, basically. The people of Israel are like, Samuel, you are a pretty cool leader. We get that you're a prophet sent by God. Here's the deal. You're getting old. You're not keeping up with the times or the technology. It's all passing you by. And you just don't understand what it looks like to lead in the modern world anymore. And so here's what's going on if you haven't been paying attention, Samuel, is that like if you look around the world around you, everyone else has a king. So if we're going to be a nation that can do anything for the Lord, we should probably wake up, smell the coffee, and grab ourselves a king. And Samuel's like, no, God is your king. And they're like, no, yeah, sure, God's our king. But you know what else would be great? Like a really tall, strong king. So that when other armies come against us, we could be like, don't, there's our king. And Samuel's like, you guys are so infuriating. And he goes to the Lord, and the Lord's like, I know, they shouldn't ask for a king. It's evil. But I don't know, this is what they do. This is what, over and over again, this is what they do. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to give them a king. And you're going to give them the king that I tell them that they're going to have. Should they have wanted a king? No. And yet the Lord condescends to their desires and says, even though you're doing something you shouldn't do, I will still make this work to accomplish my plans. I think we don't give the messiness of the kingship enough credit for those of us who think about the Bible. We just gloss right over all the kings and we're like, yeah, some were bad and some were good. But the whole concept of the kingship was just one big bad idea that God still used for his purposes. So you should feel that tension. The kingship is wrong. And yet, God tells his people, there will one day be a king who his descendants will always be on that throne for eternity. He'll be a son of David. And this whole thing that should not have existed, God still used the messiness of it, to bring our Redeemer and Savior, the eternal Son of God, Jesus, so that God could be our king, so that God still gets what he wants. So the whole story of Solomon starts out with just a huge mess. So if we think about this story as like it starts out good and then it gets complicated, it's like, no, it started out complicated. It started out super messy. And yet, what we see in this story of Solomon is that he was a loved child of God. This really caught my eye when actually Linda in our podcast pointed it out to me, and then she said this thing, and then what happens to me sometimes is people say things that make me think, and then I can't leave it out of my head until I chase it down. And so she didn't make me. Her comment made me chase this thought down. The podcast is fun because it's basically multiple episodes of me being like, Linda, you're actually right about that. 2 Samuel chapter 12, starting in verse 21. His attendants asked him, why are you acting this way? So we're going back to the scene, David mourning over the death of the son that was conceived through him and his sin with Bathsheba. Yes? That's where we're at in the story. So his attendants came to David and asked him, why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat. He answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live, but now that he's dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her, and she gave birth to a son, and so they named him Solomon. And the Lord loved him. And because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah, which sounds in Hebrew like the beloved one of Yahweh. When you said that name, Jedediah, in Hebrew, it had this like, did you just say Yahweh loves you? No, I said my son's name, Jedediah. Oh, man, I swore you said Yahweh loves you. You can almost picture, right? Solomon goes off to school, comes home, and Bathsheba looks him in the eyes, and he's like, how is school, Jedediah? Her just saying, reminding him of who he is in the Lord, the loved one. And that should encourage us. That in the midst of the messiness of situations that should not have been, God still has this pursuing love of those who are his. And he calls them by those names. So to me, where this lands us is basically where we started out, which is that the Lord doesn't require neat and tidy to accomplish his purposes for those that he loves. And the story of Solomon we're going to see has these huge mountaintop moments of just amazing things happening. And then these really deep valleys. And also this like ambiguity. I think if we really wrestle with the story of Solomon well, there should be moments in our own hearts and minds where we are always of kind of two minds of like, man, how did that story end for him? Right? At the end of the day, the story of Solomon is a story of God working in the midst of complex, messy situations. And it's a warning story for all of us to look at. And in the midst of our messy, not totally neat and tidy situations, to press forward in our obedience to Jesus, because we are the ones who are Jedediah. We are the ones who Yahweh loves. And because we're the ones who Yahweh loves, he calls us to actually follow him in his ways. And Solomon is going to be this little picture through whom we will get to see the human experience and all of its highs and lows. So I hope you're excited to keep studying for these next few weeks, because it really will be a great look at the human experience and a great look at the call to follow Jesus in the midst of the not so neat and tidy, and also for us to be okay with things around us not being always neat and tidy, because God's like, yeah, I know, and I'm still working. So you guys have about 20 minutes to work through the last few questions. You can go through the contemplating what it means for your life section on page 6. And you can also, if you want, you can add in this kind of second question that I added in, which is basically just saying that God never intended Israel to have a king, and yet he worked through the kings for his purposes. And so just trying to get us to think through, are there examples in our own life, past or present, that we can see God is using, or maybe something that he could use, that he never intended, but he could still use it for his purposes. In other words, are there those moments in our lives where we're like, yep, that probably shouldn't have happened. That's probably not what God wanted. And yet I can see how God's using that thing that shouldn't have happened for his purposes still. So have fun the next 20 minutes or so talking through some things, and I'll be wandering around, happy to engage with questions if you have some.